Hello my wonderful, beautiful friends, guys. Welcome back to r/MaliciousCompliance, where people follow exact orders to spite someone. And in today's episode, it's all about neighbors arguing over property lines. And a smug, entitled neighbor keeps ignoring what OP and her husband have to say, and they end up regretting it big time. Guys, I hope you enjoy the stories. Don't shake your heads too hard. And as always, you can send or link your post to this email right here. Let's dive in. I live in the UK, and a few years ago, my uncle wanted to add an extension to the side of his house, where his yard went round the side a bit. My uncle asked the neighbor, who's actually a really lovely older man, who said sure, feel free, and my uncle starts the work. Unfortunately, the neighbor got ill, and his demon seed starts coming over, and when they see that my uncle was building too close to the neighbor's side yard, they were furious. They immediately asked him to stop, which my uncle did, and then the demon seed insisted that he was building on the neighbor's property. Now, my uncle is a really nice guy, so to avoid any issues, he offered to buy the part of the yard he was going to extend to, and offered a reasonable £5,000 for it, as it really wasn't that big of a patch. The demon seed got greedy and he refused, so my uncle, being a gentleman, doubled it and offered £10,000, as he thought it was easier than going through the hassle of lawyers and property lines. But the kid still refused. He says to my uncle, "You are crossing my dad's property line and you can't build on it. Either give us more money or stop building. We want to sell this house when he's gone." And yes, they were waiting for the sweet neighbor to die so they can sell his house. My uncle tells him, "I think £10,000 is fair enough. I'm not using up that much and it's still close to my part of the property." The neighbor kid argues and says, "No, it's not. Check the property lines. You are way past our line. You need to offer us more money or stop building." Uncle replies, "Aren't you sure you don't want to take the money?" The kid scoffs and says, "Not what you're offering. Check the effing property lines." So my uncle complied with their wishes. He stopped all the building work because it was on their property after all. Or was it? And this is where the malicious compliance comes in. My uncle did exactly what the neighbor's son asked and accessed the land registry, and he saw the original plans for both properties and then checked the property lines to see how it was divided. And wouldn't you know it, he wasn't on their property line, but they were on his. With a massive smile, my uncle went to the neighbors the next time the kid was around and kindly showed them the plans of the properties, clearly showing where the properties were divided. Their faces were priceless when they realized that not only had they missed out on an easy £10,000, but they had also in fact lost their dad about a quarter of his yard. The neighbors had to move the fence and a big shed that was by the fence, and my uncle got to build his extension stress-free. So the moral of the story is, if you want to build and the neighbor's kids insist you should check property lines, do it. You might just save some money and gain some land. Guys, that was absolutely wonderful how that worked out. And like OP said, the kid's face must have been priceless when he realized that he was the reason that dad lost a quarter of his yard. And honestly, I do feel bad for the dad, as OP described him as a really nice man. But it just sucked that his kid happened to be a greedy a-hole though, and this was the result of that. And in this next post, OP shares their fencing story. So, recalling this story made my heart smile. A few years ago, I was building a new fence for a friend of mine. I had to remove the old sections that were falling apart first, of course. And when I got to the intersection of his back fence, his side fence, and the next door neighbor's back fence, I carefully separated the neighbor's fence from his, and proceeded to carry on removing the side sections that went between their two properties. My friend had told me that the side section was 100% on his property, and the previous owner, about 30+ years ago, had deliberately given the next door neighbor's property an extra foot or so, to ensure that he was building on his own property, without calling for and paying for a survey. The neighbor Susan, whom I will refer to as Karen for the remainder of the story, comes running outside screaming at me that I couldn't remove the side fence, and it was on their property, and just what do I think I'm doing? So I responded back very calmly that my friend had told them well in advance that he was going to replace the fence, that he was going to build it in the same place as the old one, and asked if they were willing to split costs, to which they declined. No biggie. Karen then starts screaming at me again, telling me that I had no right to do that, and that my friend did not give them proper notice, and that she didn't realize that there wouldn't be anything between the two properties to contain their dog. By now, I'm ready to lose my lid, so I knocked on my friend's back door to let him know what was going on, and that he needed to talk to Karen and that I was leaving because I didn't want to do or say anything that I would regret or cause problems with the neighbors for my friend. So with that, the entire project got put on hold, pending a property survey that was going to cost $650, and they demanded my friend pay half of that, despite him telling them the fence was definitely on his property and nothing was going to change with the new fence, and that he was fine with them continuing to have a foot or so of his property, so he didn't have to rock the boat. Fast forward to the following Monday when the surveyor comes out. It turns out that the old side fence was not a little on my friend's property, but almost 10 feet onto his property. The neighbors had built a nice raised flower bed and done a nice brick retaining wall right up along the fence line, and they spent a lot of money just in materials. Never mind the time they put in constructing it. Needless to say, my friend came away with the biggest grin on his face. For the mere price of $325, he was entitled to expand his yard of more than 30 years by about 800 square feet. And Karen and her husband spent the next week having to move their garden, retaining wall, and all of the dirt that was on my friend's property, so that I could build the fence on his side of the actual property line. The two then hired the cheapest contractors they could find to slap up a fence on their side of the property line. They spent almost as much as my friend did on their new fence. 3 years later, the last 20 feet or so of their fence is on the ground already, because it was such a crappy job that it fell over in a moderate windstorm this past spring. My friend's fence is still standing, rock solid, and his dogs are definitely making good use of the extra 800 square feet. Again, what a satisfying story, guys, and it's always nice to hear when smug a-hole neighbors get what they deserve. And for all who are wondering why the neighbors built their own fence on their property, OP comes in and says, my friend wasn't willing to spend a bunch of extra money to make the side of his fence facing their house look nice, though it wasn't ugly to begin with. But what they spent on their fence cost them several times what the wood would have cost them to just put up boards on their side of my friend's fence. So here's some background. My husband is pretty handy, and prior to COVID, he's done several flip houses as a fun side gig. It's what he loves to do, and he became very familiar with a ton of city codes. During COVID, it seemed that everyone was suddenly buying houses to flip out of boredom, and the house prices skyrocketed, so he put that on hold. He then started doing household repairs, upgrades, building fences, etc. around the neighborhood as well. To get a better understanding of the HOA bylaws and whatnot, my husband joined the HOA Architectural Committee. Through that, he learned everything: what was allowed, what wasn't, how the process worked, and how to work around things, etc. Long story short, my husband was very knowledgeable in what to do and what not to do, and various processes with the neighborhood and the city. So with that said, our neighbor next door decided that they were going to start landscaping their backyard, and they planned to make theirs as similar to our backyard as possible. But here's the problem. Despite being next door neighbors, our land was quite different. For one thing, behind our house was a bunch of brush and pine trees, maybe 3 to 4 feet from the lake that's at the back of the house. We didn't have to do a whole lot to clear the area, but the brush on their property was about a third of their yard, and I'd say about 10 feet from the water. Also, the way the houses on our street are, the land was naturally a valley. The house to our right is at the top, we're in the middle, and the next two houses are at the bottom, before it very quickly rises again. The first thing the neighbors did was to cut down all the trees in their backyard. They weren't small trees either, they were like 4-story tall trees or more. My husband and neighbor were talking about the backyard plans when my husband casually mentioned that he was surprised that the city gave him permission to cut down so many trees. Because in our city, you had to have an arborist give permission to cut down any trees that were X feet tall. The entitled neighbor then said it wasn't the city's business what he did with his backyard, and then he told my husband to mind his own business. And my husband thought, okay, fair enough. They then start putting up the retaining wall to bring it up to level with our property, which would have been about 7 to 8 feet tall. Basically, they were stacking a bunch of cinder blocks. My husband uneasily asked if their landscapers had ever done a retaining wall like that, and if the city approved it. Our city says that if a retaining wall is over 5 feet tall, you need a structural engineer to come out. The neighbor said again it wasn't any of the city's business what he did to his yard, and for my husband to mind his own damn business. While they're filling up the backyard to bring theirs level to ours, the landscapers are dumping all the dirt, gravel, and sand in the street, blocking a little over half the road. Several of the neighbors who had trucks would just hop the curb, but other neighbors with smaller cars were mad. Before my husband could ask if they could put the dirt and stuff in their driveway instead of the road, like everybody else, the neighbor just went off on my husband to F right off. And my husband again thought, well, okay then. My husband let them continue working, and he didn't say a word as they start constructing a 10 feet tall fence, which was against HOA regulation as fences could not be taller than 6 feet. Between them starting construction 6 days a week before 7 a.m. and them blocking the road, I guess somebody had enough. Because the next thing I know, city officials are out there and they put a big ass sign in the yard saying all construction was to be halted until further notice. It wasn't us, but my husband found out through the architectural committee that someone had complained about the noise and the road blockage to the HOA, who then came out to investigate, saw everything they done, and then reported them to the city. On top of that, they got a hefty fine for every tree stump the city official found. The structural engineer said their retaining wall was not sound and it had to be redone, and they had to have regular inspections during its build. The HOA also told them that not only did they have to take down their 10 feet tall fence, they also got hit with a hefty fine. Initially, the neighbor came after us for tattling, but we told them it wasn't us, as nothing they did affected us in any way. And for the record, it wasn't us that called the HOA or the city. We just let him be, but he did piss off a lot of neighbors. When the guy was cutting down those trees, he had chainsaws and wood chippers going off by 6:45. And then the bobcat was being used at 7 o'clock in the morning 6 days a week. Also, neighbors had tried to ask him to put his dirt on the driveway instead of the street, and he told them off and to mind their own business too. My husband then said that he tried to warn them this would happen, but that the neighbor told him to F off and to mind his own business, and he did. And yes, from what I heard, the tree fines were painful. Yeah, just from reading all these stories about people suffering consequences of cutting down trees without permission, I can't see it being a little fine. It was probably in the tens of thousands of dollars. And hey, this is what entitlement and stubbornness gets them. And it is good that somebody called and reported them, because there's a reason that things have to be built to meet certain codes and standards. Like that half-ass retaining wall might have given out one day and caused somebody to get seriously hurt. And this person comments, remember, when doing crimes, do one at a time. And the cherry on this thread was finding out that this was done in a HOA zone. With that said though guys, OP's malicious compliance was frickin' awesome. And I'm glad he stayed quiet, because if he ratted them out early, that would have been mercy. But you know what they say, never interrupt an a-hole when they're making a mistake. So about 5 or 6 years ago, I built a fence in my backyard. I talked to my neighbors and we decided on a good place to build the fence. We knew an approximate property line based on some survey pins, but we were both too cheap to pay a surveyor. We just shook hands and I built the fence. It was a great deal for my neighbors. I paid for everything, built the fence, and all they had to do was give me a thumbs up when it was done. And then, a year later, they sold their house. That meant I got a new neighbor. More specifically, I got Anne. Anne was from the big city, and Anne was a realtor. Anne had also flipped 8 houses in 12 years, and she loved this new house and planned on staying there for a really long time. Also, Anne had a dog. The dog's name was Razzie, and it was a German Shepherd mix that spent most of the day outside while Anne went to work. Razzie was aggressive towards children, animals, insects, and any plants that waved in the breeze. Razzie also, as Anne once told me, loved to chew on furniture, and that's why Razzie stayed outside so much. About 6 months after Anne moved in, I saw a surveyor walking around my neighborhood, and he was paying special attention to my backyard. The next day, Anne shows up at my front door with a stack of papers, and she asked me if I was gonna pay her for the 9 inches that my fence was encroaching onto her property. So of course, I explained the handshake deal with the last neighbors, but she was having no part of it. She wanted the fence moved, or she wanted money. no discussions. She had also spoken to a lawyer friend, and she was perfectly happy to take me to court over the fence. I'll never forget, she told me, "I don't know how you guys do it out here in the sticks, but where I come from, we follow rules." So with that, I got rid of the fence. The next day, I unscrewed the horizontal rails from the brackets. I then stacked the fence panels up against my garage and pulled up the fence post with my work van. About a week later, Anne shows up at my front door again. She wants to know when I'm going to be building a new fence. Well, it turns out, without my portion of the fence, she's not been able to let Razzie out unattended for the fear that he'll run away, attack something, or get hit by a car. She also told me that she can't keep him in the house all day while she's at work anymore because her furniture and carpets are all ruined. So I told her, "Well, Anne, I'm not gonna be rebuilding the fence. I don't want any legal trouble, and the best way to stay out of trouble is to not build near your property." And the look on her face was priceless. I thought she was going to cry. She did try to protest, saying she really needed the fence back and she would even help pay for a new one. She told me how much she loved the style and aesthetic of the old one, that it was just the location she had a problem with. But I stood firm. There would be no new fence, and she never got a new fence. She did make half-hearted attempts to put up some bamboo fencing, but Razzie tore through that stuff like wet newspaper. Eventually, I sold my place and moved away. I took the old fence panels with me, and I still look at them every day when I let my dog out in the morning. Guys, I just love this malicious compliance so much. Like, serves that Karen right. And really, OP's reaction to her was perfect. Like, how dare you do that to somebody and then expect them to put up a new fence? Like, it makes me so happy when smug, entitled Karens have a plan that they think is so clever, and it just backfires on them so hard. My goodness, and the fact that OP took the fence after they sold the place is the icing on this cake. One day, I come home, and my mom told me the right side neighbor talked to her. The neighbor had claimed a city official came over while we weren't there. They stopped by her house and asked her to pass along a message that the tree on our side of the fence is too unruly, and a few branches are getting too close to the neighbor's house. She then said the city will fine us if we don't cut down those branches. Hearing that, I'm thinking, so the city was gonna fine us without an official notice? I was certain that the neighbor either got the warning herself or she was lying for some free gardening. It was our tree, so we would have had it done if they asked us properly. But my mom and I decided to just cut it down so it didn't become an issue again. My mom sent me over to let the neighbors know, and after some pleasantries, I told her of our decision. Her expression immediately darkens. She says, "The tree is in a perfect place to cover my bedroom window from the SoCal sun, and it gives me plenty of privacy. Would it not be cheaper to trim it?" Cue the malicious compliance to the city warning. I told her with a concerned face that we're anxious about the city's fine, and that if we keep trimming it, it would be costly and a huge headache. At that point, some slight panic seeps into her voice. She then offered to pay for the trimming herself. In other words, we wouldn't have to do a thing nor pay a single penny. Now, a better man would have said yes, but by this point, I was a bitter man. I just kept a concerned face, and I told her if I ever left and moved out, my mom would have to deal with it, and I wouldn't want her to have to keep checking in with the neighbor for fear of a fine. At the end of the day, it's our tree, our fine, and it's our decision. I left shortly after, and the tree came down that weekend, and so did the neighbor's blinds to her bedroom. It's been a few years since then, and I haven't seen them go back up. And to think, if she had asked nicely, we would still be trimming those branches at no cost to her at all. You know what they say, play dumb games, win dumb prizes. And without that shade, I'm pretty sure the neighbor's electricity bills have gone up if she's cranking that AC to combat that hot sun. With that said though, I do feel so bad for that tree that was cut down, all because OP was spiteful towards this lying Karen. But hey, I guess at the end of the day, this is malicious compliance, right? And people do things to spite their neighbors. This story started in 2017, and it was repeated every year until this year, and I've promised my father-in-law to repeat the compliance if it ever happens again. My in-laws used to live just outside the town. They moved this past fall to my mother-in-law's home island, and we moved into their place. And when I say just outside, I mean about 2 meters outside the city plan, to be exact, and this is important for later. The city plan reached up to the middle of the dirt road that separated their property with the neighboring one. So back in spring of 2017, my in-laws received a letter from city council about cleaning their property. They wanted to clear the dead grass in preparation for summer due to fire hazards, or they would be fined. The letter and the deadline were normal, but what wasn't normal was the area named. It was their property and the property next to them, which is inside city limits, and the road in between. My father-in-law then took the letter to the council and explained that the property next to him didn't belong to him, and they couldn't clean it. They appeared to accept it, but something was nagging him. Now, my father-in-law had worked in exactly 2 companies in his life, both of them handling big government contracts, and his main job was to take care of red tape and government bureaucracy. So he found the exact law that said that the owner was responsible for their property, and the city was responsible for any roads and any properties inside city limits that an owner couldn't be found. He had also found, through his connections, that the local council was under investigation for misappropriation of funds, including the funds for cleaning lots that were considered fire hazards. Now, the tactic they used was to include lots that fell under their responsibility to nearby owners and either intimidate them to clean them or fine them and pocket the money. Well, my father-in-law decides to become creative. First, he gathered all the plans related to his property and the one next to him. Next, he cleared his property, as he was planning to do that anyway, but only that. And then he waited. The deadline passed, and about 10 days later, a hefty fine arrives, and my father-in-law challenged it officially. The council tried to enforce the fine, but my father-in-law challenged it again, presenting his evidence on an open forum of the council. The council insisted that they were on the right, and if my father-in-law didn't pay, they would take legal action. My father-in-law agreed happily to the legal action. This led the courts appointing an outside inspector to check the property, the city plans, and the work my father-in-law had done. The council had not only lost the case and had to pay legal fees, but they were forced to an outside audit that led to a couple of councilmen facing criminal charges. Every year since then, my father-in-law used to clean his property, and exactly up to the middle of the road next to him. That duty has been passed down to me now, which I fulfilled this year. Father-in-law was definitely the hero that people needed, guys. Like, that is so freaking sleazy though, right? I'm just happy to hear that the corrupt city council was exposed and something was done about it. And props to OP for continuing this malicious compliance. And that, my friends, brings us to another end of another episode of r/malicious compliance. Guys, if you enjoyed the stories today, hit that thumbs up, and if you're not subscribed, consider subscribing so you don't miss these crazy stories. And if you missed the last episode on the channel, it's an r/entitled People episode, where a psycho Karen calls 911 on a frickin' 10-year-old because that 10-year-old refused to play with her daughter. Guys, go check it out if you haven't, and myself and Stevie Boy will see you guys in the next one. We love you.